So we're just starting this first panel. I want to start just by giving you an overview of what we're going to be talking about on this first panel. So the purpose of this first panel is to get a view of where we're at in terms of where U.S. trade policy has gone in the last 9 months. What are the motivations for those developments in U.S. trade policy, and to what extent have those changes been successful in achieving the objectives or possible objectives, some of which were laid out by Ambassador Tai in her opening remarks. So we have a great mix of panelists here with us today. I'm going to give them each an opportunity to introduce themselves. If you want to share your name, the organization that you're affiliated with, and your expertise and kind of where you're coming from in terms of your view on the topic that we're going to be talking about. We're going to go ahead and start with Beth. Beth, if you want to begin by introducing yourselves and letting, we're very grateful that you're zooming in for this. If you also want to let the conference attendees know where you're joining us from, that would be great.
Very happy to be here, and sorry I can't be there with you in person. Beth Baltzan, former counselor to Ambassador Tai, whom you just heard. I'm joining you from London. There is actually a progressive summit here that they are kind enough to have found a spot so that I could multitask and do both this and spend some time with all of you.
Great, thank you, Beth. Chris, would you like to go next? We'll just go down the table.
Perfect. Morning, I'm Chris Griswold. I'm the policy director of American Compass. We are a conservative economic policy think tank whose mission is to help restore an economic consensus that emphasizes family, community, and industry's role in American prosperity and liberty, which is really just a fancy mission statement way of saying that I agree entirely with Ambassador Tai's characterization of the need to undo a failed neoliberal order and build something else. That's what we work on. I was previously a senior policy advisor to then Senator Marco Rubio.
Okay, thank you, Chris. Tim?
Tim Buthe. I hold the chair for international relations at the Munich School of Politics and Public Policy at the Technical University of Munich. I have crossed the Atlantic many times, including in my own life, having lived about half my life in the United States, most recently on the faculty at Duke University. I'm by training a political scientist. Almost all of my work is at the intersection of politics and economics and law. In that context, I've worked extensively on antitrust law and policy, including explicitly on that intersection of trade and antitrust.
Thank you, Tim. Kathleen?
I'm Kathleen Clausen. I'm a professor at Georgetown University Law Center. I'm also one of the faculty directors of our Institute of International Economic Law. And I'm a trade person, not an antitrust person, which you've heard now a couple of times this morning. But I used to work at USTR as Associate General Counsel there, both in the Biden, Trump, and briefly, and the Obama administrations as well.
Thank you, Kathleen. Cristina?
So I'm Cristina Caffara. I'm an antitrust expert, practitioner, economist. I worked for 30 years as indeed an expert in antitrust cases. I have an affiliation with UCL in London, with the Center for Economic Policy Research, and that's about that.
Okay, thank you. All right, so I have a set of 7 questions that I'm going to be posing to the panel, and I anticipate there will be time after my questions for there to be some questions from the audience. So if there are things you would like to pose either to the panel in its entirety or to particular members of the panel, you'll also have an opportunity to engage with them in your own questions. So my first question is, there have been a lot of developments in U.S. trade policy in the last 9 months, and we didn't really get into the particulars of what those developments are in Ambassador Tai's remarks. So I wanted to start us off by asking Chris to give us a summary of what exactly is different now in U.S. trade policy and trade relations relative to where we were at the end of the Biden administration. And since there's so much for Chris to lay out, to the extent that anybody on the panel thinks that Chris has omitted something, I mean, there were developments as recently as yesterday, yes. Right? We'll also then open it up to the panel to weigh in with any additional developments.
Well, I will depend on my colleagues to fill in the gaps. It's an incredibly unfair question to ask because the volume and pace of change is so immense. We would need a week, I think, of sessions to walk through the specifics of them all and their relative justifications and so on. But very quickly, I think, I mean, speaking just of the sheer volume of changes, We've seen the implementation of a 10% global tariff across the board. We've seen threats of reciprocal tariffs on everyone, basically, some of which have been implemented, some not. This is in the wake of so-called Liberation Day. We've seen goods-specific tariff action or other trade action. We've seen country-specific trade action. Canada and Mexico have their own unique situation going on, with some of their goods exempted if they are under the USMCA trade agreement. We've concluded trade deals with the UK, with Vietnam, with Japan, with Korea. I'm sure I'm missing a few. And of course, China is its entirely separate category of action with an escalating series of threatened tariffs that are now being suspended. I believe the current rate is around 30% on goods from China as we continue to negotiate a deal or not with the CCP in China. We could spend all day on any one of those categories. There's also a range of tools, as Ambassador Tai mentioned, ranging from Section 232 tariffs, which are meant to protect against imports that threaten national security, 201 safeguards, which the ambassador mentioned, 301 investigations, which respect unfair trade practices, and most controversially, and I'm sure we're going to talk a lot about this, the invocation of the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, which the current administration has decided to maximally wield to the limits of potentially to the limits of its legal, how far it can stretch. You're right, we saw actions as recently as yesterday, Section 232 tariffs, or announced investigations rather, on pharmaceuticals, on heavy trucks, on timber. This is just last night. 2 days ago, there was an announced 232 investigation on robotics. And so the pace and volume of action and the variety of action and the variety of legal tools invoked to take those actions is immense. If you are curious and want a good resource, trade complianceresourcehub.com is actually very good. It outlines all of this. It was most recently updated yesterday. And it can walk you through the specifics of each of these things. I think what might be most useful, before I let my colleagues kind of fill in the gaps, is what all that means. Because to me, the real answer to the question of what is different now in U.S. trade policy is not just the specifics, which are, some of which may or may not be legal, some of which may or may not be implemented, and so on, but it's the deeper meaning, which is, I think, in the big picture, the recognition or the belief on the part of this administration that the global trade order is broken and no longer serves the interests of the American public. They want to undo that trade order, which I think they have fairly successfully done in a very short space of time. We are in a fundamentally, I think, new era of global trade in which the old order, not just is it recognized as broken, it is being kind of systematically undone and demolished by the current administration. And the real question is whether it can be remade. And I think that effort on the part of the administration to undo the former order reflects the other big change, which is, number one, an evolving sense of what the U.S.'s role in the world is, and an evolving sense of how economics works. After the Second World War, the U.S., as we all know, accepted a certain and helped build a certain global trade order on the premise that the U.S. would be the global hegemon, and on the premise that it was in our interests to help other parts of the world, Japan, Europe, and so on, rebuild after the war. And then especially in the context of the Cold War, we accepted a certain kind of imbalanced trade arrangement as good geopolitics. That, I think, is quite clearly no longer the case. That's certainly at least what this administration believes to no longer be the case. And with that comes a reorientation about economics, that the free trade doctrine that Ambassador Tai mentioned has expired its usefulness, that trade deficits do matter, actually, which is not what conventional economics would teach us. and that trade tools are legitimate tools of both economic policy and of geopolitics and negotiating posture, as has been mentioned. And the one note I would make, just in the spirit of this conference, that I think is notably different and is in line with the evolution that Ambassador Tai described, that unites some of this new thinking on trade with antitrust, is the recognition that what we call competitive advantage very often derives from deeply uncompetitive behaviors. In the context of global trade, David Ricardo's theory of competitive advantage doesn't really apply in, say, the case of semiconductors. There's no natural advantage that Taiwan has due to its climate or soil that makes it better at making semiconductors. They decided as a matter of policy that they would be the best in the world, and then they did. And the recognition that it is policy action that generates what we see as competitive advantage is deeply, I think, fundamental to this evolving view of what's appropriate in terms of trade action, that if, say, for example, China takes certain uncompetitive measures, we have every right in the world, and in fact, it is entirely in keeping with what free market economics requires that we address it. And something similar, I think, is at work in the, and I'm not an antitrust expert, so I will defer to my colleagues, a similar kind of insight is what you're seeing in this Biden to Trump I think, continuity, that what we call competitive advantage domestically is often due to deeply uncompetitive behaviors, whether that's illegal union busting, whether that's monopolistic activity, and so on. And that delivering cheap goods to consumers, whether by importing them from communist China or from Amazon and its kind of worker surveillance mechanisms or whatever, neither of these are in the spirit of what true competition actually means and requires.
All right, thank you, Chris. Anybody else on the panel would like to weigh in?
Come back to it.
Okay, all right. I also have, I think, a fairly involved question for Kathleen. So before we delve more into the motivations and consequences of these changes in U.S. trade policy, I first want to take a step back to consider the legality of the changes. So Kathleen, would you be able to point us to the origin of President Trump's authority to impose these tariffs and to negotiate these new trade agreements, or deals as they're more commonly called? And can you also provide us with a succinct primer on the current state of litigation challenging the latest round of Trump 2 tariffs under IEEPA?
All right, like Chris, we'll see how far I get in a short time. But thank you, Cree. Thanks for the invitation. It's great to be here with y'all. So first of all, I'll say, as Chris did, if you'd like a succinct primer on these issues, a legal overview, if you will, of the litigation in particular, with my colleagues and I have a new piece out called "The America First: Trade Policy in Practice." So if you Google that and my name, you'll get it off of SSRN. It's forthcoming in the American Journal of International Law. So rather than take notes on what I say, you can just read that at your leisure. So back to the origin question. Your first question, Cree, really takes us back, and Ambassador Tai did a deep dive on some historical moments. So I'll do the same. This one takes us back to the Constitutional Convention and looking at what was put into the Constitution with respect to trade issues. And the answer there, of course, is that the power to impose tariffs and likewise the power to regulate trade with foreign nations is found in Article 1, which of course means it's a congressional authority. And so all of the president's foreign commerce related power must be delegated to him. He has no original power in this space. It all must be found in statute. So that's the critical starting point with which we begin. Then you look over time and you see, well, actually, in the intervening 200 some years, there's been a lot of delegation. Congress has delegated a great deal of authority to the president. Now we'll see just how far that goes, and we look to the litigation in a moment. But it's delegated authority really in two buckets. On the one hand, you have all the authority that Congress has delegated to raise tariffs, and on the other, it's delegated authority to lower tariffs. Two separate streams of authority, sometimes in the same acts, same statutes, but there are two clear lines of authority that Congress has delegated over the years. Most of these statutes are actually Cold War statutes. They date back to the Cold War period. And they have those sort of different lines of thinking. For those statutes, those delegations that allow the president to raise tariffs, they're almost always connected to some idea of security. Sometimes explicitly, sometimes implicitly. But they allow the president to raise tariffs or take other trade-related measures that would make it harder to trade when the president identifies some sort of security threat, some unreasonable or discriminatory burden on the U.S. economy, that type of thing. The second bucket, as I said, is the power that allows him to lower tariffs. Since that's not really happening these days, we're not going to get into that. But what's interesting between these two buckets is that the ones that allow him to raise tariffs, those authorities, they have been sort of left alone on the shelf without a lot of congressional intervention, not a lot of oversight for Congress to come in and say, actually, the president's doing it wrongly. On the other hand, those powers to lower tariffs, over the years, Congress has put more procedural hurdles in place so that when the president and the executive branch wishes to lower tariffs, it actually has to go through several steps in Congress and follow these instructions that Congress has given. So that's this inequity that you see in our tariff law for a variety of reasons we can come back to, but I think it's an important thing to bear in mind that these sort of security-related tariff-raising statutes are there without a lot of oversight. Okay, second part of Cree's question was with respect to the current state of litigation. So here's as succinct a primer as we can do in the short time that we have. I'm going to focus on the International Emergency Economic Powers Act tariffs that Chris mentioned, the IEEPA tariffs. So if you want to go around looking cool in trade circles, you have to say IEEPA tariffs. You have to say three-digit tariffs like 232, 201, 301, 338, 122. That's the way to be cool at a trade party. Okay, what's happening with IEEPA tariff litigation? You probably are aware that it's now before the Supreme Court. Now, it's not every IEEPA tariff, it's just two. It's the ones from April 2nd, which was already invoked earlier today by Ambassador Tai, and the earliest ones, so to speak, the ones on fentanyl, related to fentanyl, that have to do with Canada, Mexico, and China. So those two sets of tariffs are now being challenged, and cases are now up before the Supreme Court. Originally, we had about a dozen cases filed. Very interesting to see who is filing them, but again, we can come back to that if you wish. Most of them are paused while these three somewhat consolidated cases go to the Supreme Court. November 5th, we will have oral argument before the Supreme Court, and that means that any time from November 6th to the end of June, we'll have a decision on these tariffs and whether the president is allowed to impose tariffs under this law. That's the main question. Can the president use the IEEPA statute to impose tariffs? Now, why is that a question? What does the IEEPA statute say? Well, the primary argument by these plaintiffs is that IEEPA does not allow the president to impose tariffs because it doesn't say tariffs. It doesn't use that word. It doesn't mention duties or tariffs or any synonym that you can come up with. Rather, what it says is regulate importation. It gives the president the power to regulate importation. So does regulate importation include putting tariffs? That's the question that the Supreme Court is facing sort of most centrally. There are other ways in which the court may come out on this. There are other arguments, plenty of other arguments in there about the state of the emergency that he's declared, about something we call the major questions doctrine that lawyers will surely be familiar with, whether the Congress has to be clearer than it has been in that law about the power to impose tariffs, whether it violates the non-delegation doctrine to think of this as a power to impose tariffs. The list goes on. So those are the issues before the court. We'll see how it comes out. You may know that the lower courts, both the Court of International Trade, where these began, as well as the D.C. District Court, and now the Federal Circuit Court of Appeals, have all said these tariffs are illegal for one reason or another. The Federal Circuit said by a vote of 7-4, he can't do this. But they put that decision on pause until the Supreme Court weighs in. Last thing I'll say here, Cree, and then I'll cede the floor back to you, has to do with outcomes. And this is where I wish I had a working crystal ball and I'd get paid a lot more than I am now as to what the Supreme Court might do. So obviously, it could go either way. That 7-4 vote was a lot closer than people thought at the Court of Appeals. So there are plenty of ways to reach a decision on this, and the Supreme Court, I expect, will issue several different opinions as the justices line up in different ways. As I mentioned, there are several arguments before them, so they could pick on any of those to reach that outcome. For a long time, I've thought that they will uphold the tariffs, that they'll go against these lower courts, and they will allow President Trump's tariff program to continue under the IEEPA. But there's a theory out there that maybe they will not, in part because they are facing a bit of a legitimacy crisis, and they need to show themselves as standing up against the president in some way, and maybe this will be the case where the Supreme Court will actually come down and say, no, President Trump, you've actually gone too far. And you can see several routes by which they could reach that. They could also come in and say, well, we're just going to narrow what you can do under the IEEPA, and then the president can go back and change it. But the bottom line here, Cree, I think, is that, in my view, whatever the Supreme Court says is probably a bit of a distraction from what you already heard from Chris, is a robust tariff program. That no matter what the court says about these IEEPA-specific tariffs, there are many other authorities, I mentioned those 3-digit ones, that he could use to put tariffs on a lot of different products, that he can use to shape the global economy, and that's not going away no matter what the Supreme Court says. Very last point is you also asked about deals. We can get into that in greater detail if you wish. My general opinion is that none of the deals are legal under U.S. law, but that's not under challenge at this time, and probably would be very difficult to bring before a court.
Just a quick follow-up, Kathleen. So
Sure.
why do you say that deals are not legal under U.S. law, and then why are they still such an effective tool if not legal?
Yeah. The reason is that, like I said at the outset, all of the president's authority must be delegated. And there's no part of any law that says that he can enter into these deals under with respect to the IEEPA as his premise, right? There's no part of the IEEPA that says you can enter into trade deals. Just like, again, people who come out and say there's no part of IEEPA that says he can raise tariffs. So my position is that the president does not have the authority under IEEPA to enter into these deals. I would also suggest that, has he really entered into any deal? Certainly not as a matter of international law. We don't seem to have any signed binding agreements, so maybe they don't even qualify in that respect. But no matter how you look at it, he doesn't have, as I see it, he does not have the domestic foundation, the authority to enter into it. If he's entered into anything, what he's doing instead, and this is where it gets rather interesting, right? He's just issuing executive orders that says he's implementing something. So he's trying to sort of take these domestic statutes in new directions, right, and say he's implementing a deal that maybe doesn't exist. That's the simplest way to put it, but I love that conversation, and we could certainly have it all day long.
All right, thank you, Kathleen. All right, so I want to now pivot back to the competing narratives as to why the U.S. is making these changes in U.S. trade policy. And I'm going to open this up to the entire panel to posit what some of these motivations are. So what is it that's animating the current administration in its changes in U.S. trade policy?
Well,
Yeah,
maybe
Tim.
I'll start with a couple of points, if I may. As the ambassador pointed out, you can use tariffs for a whole host of purposes. What you can't do is use them for all kinds of purposes at the same time when the purposes just don't jive. So two of the most important ones that get asserted, at least by the administration, right, as reasons is, on the one hand, to encourage domestic investments, to bring more manufacturing in particular back into the United States by basically erecting barriers for foreign competitors or competing products to be supplying the US market. And you can use tariffs for that purpose. The other reason that gets thrown around quite frequently is basically as a negotiating tactic to bring tariffs in other countries down and then end up with mutually lower tariffs. That too you can do, although, you know, as a matter of what the U.S. has actually committed to by way of tariffs under international trade law, for what it's worth under current circumstances, it makes that maybe a little bit harder if the other side conceives all these tariffs as actually being both illegal and illegitimate. The negotiating position may not be as strong, but the importance of the U.S. market for many other countries in the world makes them, at least temporarily, quite clearly willing to have negotiations or conversations over deals or whatever you might want to call that. But you can't have it both ways. You can't mutually lower tariffs and actually encourage domestic investments by having tariff barriers at the same time. And I think this is just sort of one example, right, of the many ways in which there is a lack of clear coherence. Maybe that's because the administration is still figuring out what it actually wants to achieve, what that next economic order, I guess, for the United States or for the globe might look like. But that makes it very difficult to come up with a coherent story, and that makes it very difficult to glance into that crystal ball, because there is, the confidence intervals, if you want to think of it statistically, are enormous, or if not boundless, and so we don't know where this all is going. The one thing that I would add is that Trump himself and some in his administration certainly seem to be brilliant at identifying ways in which they can gain benefits or an advantageous position in U.S. domestic politics. And so it seems to me the first thing to always ask yourself in the face of any policy announcement from the administration is who is actually going to benefit from this politically in the United States. It seems often like what the economic consequences are is quite secondary to the decision making.
Right,
Can
thanks,
I
Tim.
can I jump in maybe and offer a perspective as a non-American? The discussion here is inevitably, at least at the start, focused very much on trade and tariffs. And of course, the motivation for these ostensibly is we need to reduce the deficit, we need to reshore manufacturing. All of this is understood. From the perspective of someone who is in another continent at the receiving end of these tariffs, it is very, very clear that these tariffs are an instrument of statecraft in multiple directions and of geopolitical intervention in multiple dimensions. Because what underpins a lot of the narrative behind them when you are a European and you hear what is essentially used as a motivation is you had it too easy for too long. You Europeans have actually been free riding on the great American market. There is a real unhappiness about the mercantilist sort of countries, particularly in Asia, which have exploited American markets without giving enough in return, and with the Europeans being like the overgrown teenage in the basement who is told by daddy a couple of times to go find a job, but he doesn't, and sits morosely there and relies on daddy, the United States, to protect him and feed him. So there is a very strong narrative when you are in Europe that these tariffs are also motivated strongly by an intent to wield change in multiple areas of policy that the United States doesn't like. And that's your prerogative as certainly a country and a big power, but particularly relevant in a discussion of antitrust and trade is the entire impact this is having on antitrust enforcement in Europe, which is dead, okay? It is dead because one of the very direct threats that has been made to Europe is, do you want digital enforcement or do you want a car industry, okay? If you don't want a car industry, be my guest, we'll raise the tariffs. You can have your digital enforcement. We can talk about it further, but when you're looking for the motivations, there is no question that much of it is also, when it comes to other continents, an intent to correct what is perceived as free riding, what is perceived as extraction from the great American companies. The narrative has changed. The great American digital companies, Google, Amazon, etc., which are in Europe under investigation, are certainly seen as something to protect from prying extractive Europeans who haven't got their own. And tariffs on the bits of Europe that work like cars are wielded to discipline us to shut up and go away on all of this. So this is the reality.
All right, thank you, Cristina. Chris?
Yeah, I think there are a couple other potential motivations that haven't been addressed. One is very China-specific, and that's supply chain independence. And I think it's pretty reasonable and probably a point of agreement across the aisle, certainly between folks like myself and people like Ambassador Tai, that we have an unacceptable dependence on China for certain critical goods, and that tariffs are a legitimate and probably necessary mechanism to force a change in that arrangement. That is specific to that particular trading relationship, but I think it needs to be mentioned as pretty important and clearly operative, at least in the discussion around China specifically. And you see quite serious legislation on Capitol Hill addressed squarely as rescinding China's permanent normal trade relations status, creating a new tariff column in the harmonized tariff schedule specifically to try and wean us off of certain critical goods and so forth. So that deserves to be mentioned. And then I certainly agree that I think we're all aware of the trade deficit as a motivator. It does deserve to be mentioned, though. I think it's incredibly important and is clearly operative in the minds of this particular administration, that it is an unsustainable arrangement for the U.S. to absorb the production of the rest of the world without some kind of corresponding ability to export or willingness to export our own goods. And instead what we export is, of course, our assets. And so there's a relationship here between our trade deficit and our fiscal deficit, for example, because if you can't finance your addiction to cheap imports with your own exports, you finance it by selling your assets. That's corporate equity, that's, real estate to some extent, and it's treasury debt. So I think that is a legitimate and deeply operative concern. Just another comment. I think it's useful, at least from my perspective, to distinguish between very broad intent and then kind of clarity of purpose in the particulars and predictability in the implementation. Certainly, if I'm going to show my cards in my own view, I'm deeply sympathetic to the broad intent of what this administration is trying to do. And similarly with the more aggressive trade posture that President Biden took. I think it's entirely right to try and remake what was a broken arrangement. That's a different thing than saying that they're being clear about the specifics. They're quite clearly not being very clear. And I agree, there's a mix of motivations all operative at the same time. And that's not particularly helpful. I think they've done an excellent job demolishing the old order. They haven't rebuilt a new one yet at all. And if they want to, they're going to have to get clearer about just the order of priority of these different motivations and so on. And I think, just a last thought, I think this relates to the prior question about there's a question of legal authority of what the president can do. There's also just a normative question of what the executive should do versus the legislature. And in my view, if what you want is clarity of purpose and also, predictability in implementation, legislation is the vastly superior option. If you want to wean us off of Chinese critical goods and that dependency, if you want to rebalance trade, if you want to incent companies to reshore here or foreign companies to do more greenfield investment here, you need to give them predictability and certainty, which legislation is able to do in a way that executive action cannot. What the president giveth, he can taketh away, so can the next president. What the courts allow, they can taketh away, of course. And so that's my flag in the ground for the value of legislation as it relates to this question of intent and motivation and purpose.
Cree, can I just add one thing on this question?
Yes.
Just, again, very sort of lawyerly answer here, but I do think it's important to disaggregate when you're asking about motivation. Each of the statutes, right, has a different, although they all have security at their core, they have a slightly different frame for what type of security issue is the president trying to correct for. And I think it's when he's started to lump a lot of things together under certain security arguments where, of course, the credibility concerns come in. But I do think that if the president had only used the IEPA, for example, to go after Russian oil imports, right? That's a more recent use that he's used of IEPA. He said any country, we call these secondary tariffs now, any country that imports Russian oil is at risk of getting tariffed. Their products will have faced tariffs in the United States. And same thing with Venezuela. If he had just used that statute for that purpose, right, and said, I'm clearly going after the Russian threat, or I'm clearly going after the Venezuelan threat, I think we'd have a lot less concern, again, as a legal matter, as to whether the statute allows him to do tariffs in the first place. It's when he's linking these emergencies, right, to tariffs that what people got really, really nervous. Like, that's not really an emergency. It's really the core of what they're saying.
Yeah, thank you.
I think Cristina may well be right on the intent, but I want to make sure that we have clarity that the empirical validity of the underlying claim by the administration is just not true. As a matter of both economic analysis and political analysis, the one country that has benefited quite clearly from the system that we've had in international trade for the last about 8 decades has been the United States. And that has not somehow ended a few years ago.
Yeah, but I mean, they don't care about that, and that empirical observation is totally irrelevant. The point is, what do they believe is the case and what others are prepared to accept? And it is clear Europeans have rolled over. So, I mean...
I'm not questioning that. I'm just saying that the reasoning...
Okay, but that's an academic...
claims made to justify that.
I understand, but that's an academic interest. I just see what's on the ground, which is the Europeans have said, oh my God, we're all over, and therefore that assumption has power.
Just for the sake of the discussion,
could I just jump in on the point of the United States benefiting? This
Yes,
is really
Beth.
essential. Who in the United States benefited? American multinational corporations benefited. Financiers benefited. The whole reason that we have a popular revolt against the old system is because as the United States was the market of first and last resort, we absorbed the excess capacity. We were first in line for that. And that's why we experienced deindustrialization that Europe is headed towards. So it's really important. I understand the concept that the United States benefited, but that narrative obscures the deeper problem we have that has undermined our democracy because the nature of the governance did not actually benefit a lot of working people. So we've got to disaggregate who in the United States benefited and how if we're going to be able to rebuild a system that works better.
I would just like to fully associate myself with that comment. I think it's exactly right, and it speaks to the I'd be really curious what empirical measures you're using to make the assertion. I mean, I think because I do think there's a philosophical shift at play here, where GDP, for example, is in my view, and I think in the view of the popular revolt that's being described, is a incomplete metric. For example, corporate profits are an incomplete metric. Consumer prices are an inadequate metric to measure the actual health of the American economy as it relates to the ability to have a decent life in a working class town and afford to raise a family and so on. So I agree with that observation completely. And to some extent, there's, I think, a data fight that really matters about what. And certainly even beyond the data, I think you're exactly right. I agree that there's just a political reality of what kinds of concerns the American voting public wants addressed versus others.
But the increasing inequality is not a function of trade policy above all. There is a whole plethora of policies, most of them domestic.
Certainly agree, yes.
The driver of that.
Yeah. Thank you all for your weighing in on that question. I want to turn again to Beth. So it seems like, from what we've heard from Ambassador Tai and from some of your comments, that the types of tariffs that are being implemented under the Trump administration to achieve some of these onshoring of production objectives, there's some alignment between what the Biden administration was trying to achieve and what the Trump administration is trying to achieve in its second term. And I was curious to know, from your perspective, playing a role in the prior administration, what was your reaction in seeing these tariffs when they were being put into place? do you feel like the Biden administration could have been more aggressive in their use of tariffs to achieve some of their objectives, watching what the Trump administration has done? And if not, what were some of the considerations at the time that to move forward with caution, I guess, and being less aggressive on the tariff front?
Thanks for that question. And this is a really good conversation. A lot of tariff conversations go off the rails very quickly. So I really appreciate the nature of the discourse here. Picking up on what Chris was saying about the neoliberal order, and this, I want to get to Tim's comment because this is something we really have to deal with. And what's important here, as I've just said, I'm at a progressive conference, and Chris is obviously on the other side of the aisle. So I think this is really helpful. I think in both parties, we each have a neoliberal wing. And the neoliberal wing is going to be allergic to tariffs. The neoliberal wing is also allergic to anti-monopoly. So we are fighting similar struggles in our parties, and that's why you see some sense of common cause. So in every administration, including the current one, less so perhaps than in the previous one, you have people who are going to be thinking about tariffs in the old way, which is that there's a global free market out there and tariffs are distorting it. There is no global free market. This is why I think there's a lot of similarity between the trade conversation and the antitrust conversation, which is how I met Cristina, if I could just say. There's resistance to tariffs. And so I believe each of our parties is going through a process of figuring out how to get past the false Econ 101 narrative that tariffs are always bad when we don't have a global free market. We have a global marketplace full of distortions. If you don't have tariffs and other tools on the table, you're not going to be able to counter those distortions. And that is part of the problem that led us to such an extreme situation where we're seeing the current administration be so aggressive. So to answer your question, it was difficult within the Biden administration. Trade is done on an interagency basis for a reason. Everyone has equities. Our farmers are very dependent on foreign markets. So if you're using a tariff policy that results in retaliation, it's probably going to hit our farmers, and we're seeing that right now. These are important conversations, but you're going to have different camps, I think, in every administration. One thing I wanted to point out with Tim's comment, there is, and I want to acknowledge that Tim didn't make this point, but there's a very strong desire to argue that the real loss of jobs was automation or it was something else. There is such a desire by people who valued the old system to protect the old system at all costs. And so even talking about labor and environmental standards at the World Trade Organization is a bridge too far for most people, even though labor standards were supposed to be part of the original multilateral trading system in 1948. So you have real challenges where people desperately don't want to touch the rules of the rules-based order. We're all venerating the rules-based order and ignoring what the rules are. The failure to have labor rules in a system of increasing capital flows allows the offshoring of jobs and production to places like the People's Republic of China. Chris's point about manufactured comparative advantage that allows American companies to go abroad and use it or threaten to go abroad to break labor power here in the United States. It's a really problematic dynamic. And so we haven't seen the wage growth that we would like to see. The argument that automation is principally responsible for the decline of American manufacturing jobs is a curious one to me. If that were true, then during the pandemic, once we exited our lockdowns, we wouldn't have had any shortages. We heard nothing more than ships stuck on the ocean with inputs that our manufacturers needed, or finished goods or masks or what have you. The Chinese lockdowns affected us a lot. So I think we've got to do a better job of being willing to to really ask ourselves hard questions about the rules of the rules-based order. I can't stress enough, the way we created the WTO in 1995 was under a neoliberal regime, in stark contrast to the more Keynesian orientation of the International Trade Organization Charter from 1948. And since this is a trade and antitrust conference, I'm just going to say that charter in 1948 had anti-monopoly rules in it.
Thank you, Beth. So I want to open up for the rest of the panel, but I'm going to give Cristina an opportunity to take a first pass at answering this question. To what extent do you think the U.S. has been successful in achieving its range of objectives that have been laid out here in the panel? And to the extent that it's too early, so Ambassador Tai, in her remarks, she said, we're only 8 months and so many days into President Trump's second term, and she did not articulate a grade for how we're performing. That's kind of yet to be determined. So what are some of the metrics that we should be watching to measure whether or not, and determine whether or not the U.S. has been successful in achieving its objectives?
I think it's just too early to really kind of draw any conclusion. I'll go back to this, but I think given this event is really motivated by the interaction between antitrust and trade, I want to go back actually to the discussion that Ambassador Tai had and some of the points Beth made, because we focus a lot on tariffs. This is why the whole thing is so salient right now, but the question of how antitrust and trade actually interact is one that precedes this administration, and it's one that is not just hinging on tariffs. We'll get back to that. But the reason I as an antitrust specialist, if you like, I knew nothing about trade, but I got interested in this, is because during the Biden administration, I could see as an antitrust person that there was a broader conversation that was essentially being developed between the antitrust enforcers and their vision of anti-monopoly and the trade people, such as indeed Catherine Tai and Beth. And that's when I reached out and I was trying to understand really what this kind of common anti-monopoly theme really meant for the antitrust world, because antitrust is so siloed, as we've discussed. We never kind of look or interest ourselves in the bigger picture of trade. And this is, again, not a vision of, some sort of commonality at some level that in some way would somewhat trickle down to antitrust enforcement. What was powerful to me in the vision that Catherine and Beth and others in the administration were putting forward is this vision that corporate power, anti-monopoly, is a very salient feature in our society in every dimension. And it isn't just the business of the antitrust authorities to try and contain it or do something about that. There are also dimensions outside of antitrust, seemingly, in trade, for example, in which the decisions that an administration takes are salient for the way in which that corporate power is cemented, is established, and is then protected. One of the things, again, I learned from Beth and Catherine was their view of the way in which digital rules were being traditionally effectively applied. There was a view that trading data should have been completely free because, it was the little bit of grease that was oiling the world economy. And there was blindness to the fact that this total freedom in moving data across borders was actually one of the things that cemented the power of digital platforms. And so the question was extremely appropriate. If we are fighting or we are addressing corporate power of digital platforms at home through antitrust, shouldn't we be also thinking about how trade policy is addressing their ability to move data around, for example, because that is relevant to the way in which their power is ultimately established and cemented. So there is an interesting and an essential connection that I think is missed in normal times, let's say pre-tariff times, between these two disciplines. And this is what I was alluding to when I was saying earlier to Catherine that, you know, I dragged Catherine to Europe and Beth multiple times to talk about these issues in front of an antitrust audience, because it is very salient to me that the antitrust people broaden out and understand that trade matters for what we do as antitrust people. So that is the foundation. Then there is the whole issue, which is somewhat separate. We have these tariffs, and what does it mean for antitrust enforcement? I said it before, I won't be going on for too long. We are in a different paradigm in which there is a way in which tariffs are wielded to achieve a raft of objectives, one of which is also discipline, unwelcome treatment of American companies by foreign bodies. I mean, this is undisputable. We know that there is a very clear intent to protect American companies against what is perceived, and I'm not disputing I mean, there is a perception that what Europeans are trying to do, for example, in enforcement against digital platform is entirely an extractive, unfair, unmotivated action. I had this discussion, you know, with people in the administration, and I was saying, but you know, isn't it curious? You're also pursuing some of these companies through the antitrust laws in the US. And you take offense at the fact that the Europeans are trying to do digital regulation. They're the same companies. I think much of the regulation, let me just say this, is dumb. I hate regulation and I think it's stupid. So it's not that I'm protecting regulation, but I also think it is somewhat curious that these tariffs are wielded to get the Europeans beaten down on these kind of areas, when the view is not dissimilar here. There are some things that these companies are doing that are problematic. But the bottom line, and I'll conclude here, is that the reality today in Europe is that antitrust enforcement, particularly in digital, particularly against American companies, is over, simply over. And we've seen it in the recent TATEC decision by the European Commission, in which Google is being fined a trivial amount and then is being told to go away. After 60 days, come back with a solution. Like, you know, you've been working with them you've been investigating with them for 6 years, you couldn't come up with a solution. You think they have to go away for 60 days and they'll come up with something new? No one has thought about it? No. It is just to provide a face-saving sort of outcome in which the Commission gets to say, oh, we still think they're bad, and Google says, smile like Cheshire Cat, and the administration says, okay, fine, sword of Damocles over you. If you do anything more serious, we'll raise tariffs again. So that's the reality. Today, antitrust enforcement is severely undermined by this. And it is the reality in which we are operating in Europe.
Yeah, Tim.
Your question was about the effectiveness of these measures in order to achieve the objectives. And as long as the administration itself is confused about what its objectives are, I think it's impossible to come to a conclusion as to how effective they are in achieving them. But let me make two other points related to that. I agree with almost everything that Beth said. The kicker to me is that tariffs may well be the least effective tool to achieve better labor outcomes, better environmental outcomes, etc., and so forth. At best, what they create is an opening, a certain reprieve for some time, for different domestic coalitions to maybe come together and actually address those issues directly. But tariffs by themselves are not going to solve any of that. And they do a lot of damage on the sides, it seems. The other thing is that, to my mind, the most convincing, strongest analyses showing that automation and more broadly really technological change is a far more important driver of increasing inequality and the increasing weakness of the American labor movement, which is, by the way, of course, not just an American phenomenon. We see this basically across the industrialized world. They come from colleagues who are definitely not rabid neoliberals. They are, for the most part, people who are actually very much committed to less inequality, to better environmental outcomes, including in some cases because that's where they live in the United States and elsewhere. They're going to be directly affected by climate change in a really, really bad way. I just don't see any evidence that at least convincing analyses, I'm not talking about the political rhetoric, I'm talking about serious economic analyses, come from people who are just sort of trying to defend the status quo and are completely prejudiced. I think that's just not right.
Thank you. Chris, did you want to weigh in on this question before we?
Sure. I think there's a couple things to say. One, I think on the very specific, discrete question, and I think Ambassador Tai framed it well, that there's this perception in a lot of economics academia and in popular media that tariffs are just bad. I think it's worth noting that the sky has not yet fallen, even despite the relatively chaotic way that this administration is prosecuting their tariff agenda, which makes me quite bullish on tariffs implemented better. I mean, if the sky hasn't fallen yet and you get these perpetual stories, I just saw one the other day that's super confused by the surge in CapEx despite this trade uncertainty. It's I think it's worth reassessing the general posture that we have about the relative damages versus benefits that tariffs can deliver. That having been said, I agree entirely with you that I wrote a piece a couple of months ago called "Not by Tariff Alone," which is a line I stole from Ha-Joon Chang, who's my favorite economist, making this point that I don't see how the U.S. can reindustrialize without the aggressive use of tariffs. But if tariffs are the only thing you're using to accomplish that, it's not going to work. You need sound, well-implemented industrial policy, which I think the Biden administration did better than the current one is doing. You need different tax policy that rewards investment rather than stock buybacks to just disgorge your cash back to shareholders to make your quarterly earnings report smoother. You need a whole suite of policies oriented to that end. And I agree entirely that this administration has not yet delivered a clear vision for how all these policy pieces fit together. And I think, to me, that speaks to the previous point as well about antitrust enforcement in the EU, for example, and the point Beth made about the neoliberal wing in both parties. I think it was certainly clear to see in the Biden administration the tensions that you all had to navigate. It's certainly true in the Trump administration as well. And the way I would articulate that is between the quite genuinely economically populists in the administration and the plutocrats in the administration. And they're both there. And it's dishonest to deny either half of that equation. They're both there. And you see that in some of the internal fights that this administration is experiencing. And so to my mind, the solution to the problem you're describing, which is you would like to do antitrust enforcement on Google in the EU, which of course runs into a sovereignty problem. It's wait a minute, we didn't elect Brussels to govern how American companies can govern themselves. We elect people to do that. The solution is well, then we need to do that here, to your point. I think the driving problem here is a failure of antitrust enforcement in the US. And that too is a point of contestation between populists and plutocrats in the current administration. And you see this kind of, just a huge settlement with Amazon the other day. I think a lot of the people who have a posture you don't like on the trade issues are also skeptical of these tech companies. Of course, you're right about that. And so there's an internal coherence question, both for the kind of new populist right, I think for the post-neoliberal left, that all of this doesn't get sorted out until there's more resolution internal to those coalitions about what the real thing is here, in my opinion.
Thank you, Chris. So we're going to pivot now. We have about 15 minutes left in our first panel. So I've got a final question that I'll pose to the panel, and then if you have a question you'd like to pose to this panel, we'll open up the floor to you all. One of the potential downsides that we're going to be exploring in depth in our second panel after lunch is that higher tariffs may adversely affect competition in both the U.S. and global economies by either first, providing companies an opportunity to increase prices above competitive levels under the cover of higher tariffs, and second, by driving consolidation by some companies and exit by others, leading to more market concentration and less competition. So starting with Tim, I wanted to ask if any of you would like to weigh in on these potential effects to tee up the discussion that we're going to be having in our second panel.
So I'm going to very briefly speak to this issue of the relationship between trade and antitrust, which is, after all, the overarching theme for the conference, although we haven't all that much talked about it systematically. And I see essentially sort of three ways in which one can think about that. One is that antitrust can actually be, and has often been warned about, as a potential substitute for protectionism. If antitrust is enforced selectively and from either macroeconomic or from a responsiveness to political lobbying perspective, there are reasons to be concerned that antitrust might be over-enforced vis-a-vis importers and under-enforced vis-a-vis exporters. Those concerns have been around for decades. I'm not telling anything new here, but that is a concern about some of that interface between trade and antitrust that remains in principle valid. Now, the counter-position to some extent is, if you want more of a neoliberal one, I suppose, that actually pitches trade as a substitute for antitrust, because trade opens up the domestic market to foreign competitors, and there are a few people who over the decades have claimed that therefore, if you actually open markets, you need less antitrust enforcement, because basically foreign competitors will take care of that. The third view, which I've been sort of advocating for some time, is to really think seriously about the possibility that opening up your market, basically the globalization of economic relationships and globalization of markets, also creates opportunities and incentives for the globalization of anti-competitive behavior, and therefore we might actually need to be, if anything, more vigorous maybe in at least paying close attention to anti-competitive behavior and having the potential for effective antitrust enforcement in global markets. Now, that too is not actually entirely new, novel insights, as somebody mentioned a moment ago, right? The 1947 International Trade Organization Treaty, of which nothing but the GATT in the end became implemented, which was the stopgap agreement until all the ratifications were supposed to have come in. That ITO treaty actually foresaw a basically sort of global level antitrust regime to accompany the increasingly free trade regime that was envisioned under the ITO. When the World Trade Organization replaced the GATT in the 1990s, much was actually revived of the thinking of that sort of late 1940s regime, but the international antitrust was put aside quite early on, actually, at least as much as at American insistence as at anybody else's. But it's, I think the fundamental validity that there might be actually a synergistic relationship between antitrust and having a free trade regime may be quite correct, although again, by itself, that's not enough. I don't think antitrust is particularly well suited to address labor inequality issues or environmental issues or anything else that you might have on your list of sort of core objectives, even though, of course, you can think of those as sort of fairness that you might want to take into account in an antitrust enforcement. The other big thing that I wanted to briefly say is that so every economic actor, including every country, pursues its self-interest in some sense. Right? The key question is how you actually define that self-interest and how you go about pursuing that. But there's nothing wrong as such with the Trump administration or anybody else pursuing the national interest. In fact, a democratically elected government probably has a political and maybe even in some contexts legal obligation to do that. But what is this actually? In the trade realm, right, trade is inherently about a division of labor, which creates necessarily and you might even want that interdependence. That is a mutual dependence of the trading partners. That's not necessarily that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a balance in that mutual dependence, but it does mean that to some extent each side is dependent on the other, and that requires a certain level of trust not to be taken advantage of by the other side. Some of the key concerns about the relationship with China, frankly, in recent years, has been precisely that China has been increasingly giving clear signals that it is willing to abuse, if you want, that mutual dependence for its own political ends, and that has contributed, I think, heavily to the pushback against having a relatively liberal economic relationship with China. One of the big sort of distinguishing characteristics, maybe the crucial distinguishing characteristics of the age of American empire after World War II has been that, unlike most empires through world history, the United States has not, until quite recently, been seen as predatory. Most empires, the center of them has been predatory towards its vassals and the rest of the world that it could actually have any influence over. If you asked about sort of the cost and consequences, I think the biggest concern is that in Europe, but also in many other parts of the world, with this administration's policies in trade and some other areas, the United States is increasingly seen as a predatory empire. And that has usually not gone particularly well for a willingness to cooperate, for a willingness to move forward on any number of problem-solving issues. And I'm very much concerned that this is going to do a lot of harm. We see this specifically on trade in previous occasions when there's a trade model that's been around since the 1820s, known as optimal tariff theory. You can actually, with the standard assumptions of economics, show that if you're a large market in a particular product, there is an optimal tariff from a national interest point of view above zero, from a purely economic logic, that will have more of the sort of basically global benefit than the rest. It comes at your trading partner's expense. And about every 20 to 25 years throughout economic history, since the 1820s, somebody or other smart, sooner or later, or thinking of himself as very smart, has tried that. And lo and behold, every time, sooner or later, it's resulted in higher tariffs for everybody, because nobody is a large market and nobody is a hegemon in everything. And it generally goes over very poorly with one's trading partners for them to have the sense that they're being taken advantage of. And at least the rhetoric and the practice in the last 8 months suggests very much that right now the United States is out to take advantage of the rest of the world. And I think that's very unfortunate.
Kathleen, it looked like you wanted to weigh in.
Yeah, but a very small point of it, and don't want to take away from Tim's very, very useful overview, but on the very small point of driving consolidation by some companies and exit by others, that actually is, without them saying it in those terms, part of the argument of the plaintiffs in the cases that are now before the Supreme Court, because all the companies that have filed these cases are teeny tiny companies that say, we can't survive, we can't do this. You do not see the Amazons, the Walmarts, the big retailers or big companies generally filing these cases. Why? Because they have other avenues to get done what they want to get done, among other reasons. So I think that's an important point, that in trade space, we don't actually think about it in those terms, but that's actually what these little companies are arguing.
Yeah, thank you. Cristina?
Could I jump?
Yeah,
sorry.
Beth.
Yeah, Beth.
Just to pick up on something, we should also recognize that the concentration of supply chains in the PRC was a driver of sellers' inflation during the pandemic. So the view is usually that it's the presence of tariffs that can drive anti-competitive behavior. But in this case, it was actually the removal of a lot of tariffs through 40 years of tariff liberalization without guardrails, which is really my point. The ITO charter had balance between labor and capital. We did not have that same balance in the WTO system. And so you ended up with this concentration of supply chains in the PRC. So we should keep our eye, the way Adam Smith did, the OG of trade and antitrust. His grievance wasn't with tariffs, it was with tariffs in support of monopolists who captured the legislature and were extracting monopoly rents. So when we think about it that way, we can see tariffs and how they're being used. Is their presence or their absence being used to prop up monopolies and empower them? And that is what we should be addressing, as opposed to just fixating on the tool of choice.
Thanks, Beth. Cristina?
Well, there was much to disagree with, I must say. I didn't agree with much of what you said, Tim, but I won't go into a detailed discussion. Other than, the vision you present of antitrust and free trade being complements, I just don't see it. I mean, the issue is precisely that the idea that free trade is something that liberates markets and therefore reduces antitrust problems has been shown to not work in practice, because it has been precisely the free trade in data which has entrenched the digital monopolies everywhere, which we now have to fight with antitrust. So it's not the case that there is a unique and complementary kind of symbiosis between free trade and antitrust. So tariffs, I can see they have a point when there is a perception that there is an imbalance. There has been a big imbalance. The discussion in this administration, which I can see as a European, is, look, you guys have been basically free riding on us for the longest of time. And you may not like that. As a European, I feel, oops, but it's true. And the reality is that it's a wake-up call in which we at the European end have done nothing on defense, have done very little on antitrust. I mean, to Chris's point, yes, there is a question of how to actually enforce against broad global antitrust monopolies. Can the Europeans do anything about it, or is it the case that we should leave it to the Americans? But the Americans are not doing very much either. Look at the latest decision on Google. It didn't go anywhere. So there is a question there, which I think is live, and Europeans have to answer. What exactly has been our contribution to some of these things? And I think it is not illegitimate that we are told to wake up and smell the coffee. So that's I think, okay. And I don't think it is fair to say, oh, America is just being perceived as predatory. It's true, but that's because we've been hiding under the table for this long. We don't have a defense. We don't have any. We don't have an army. And then we have a war. I mean, Mr. Putin isn't coming to Boston. He's coming to Warsaw, and he's coming to Copenhagen. And we have nothing to save us from that. So I can see that from the American perspective. It's like, hello there. Will you do something? So I think that's how I see it.
Cristina, welcome to the Trump administration.
I know. I mean, it's uncanny.
All right, so we have, we'll take time for one question from the audience before we break for lunch, if anybody would like to come and pose a question to the audience. Michael, looks like Michael would like to pose the first question. Okay.
If nobody has one, I have one, Cree.
Yes, Kathleen.
But I just want to give them the first right of.
All right, I think.
Okay.
I think you
My
get to ask the
question is for you, antitrust experts. How you view the investment aspects of the deals. Catherine ended with a really, I thought, important point about how the deals may be supporting, if I understood her correctly, how the deals may be supporting our foreign major industries, right, and more than inside. And so I just want to get your perspective on this, and it goes to something I think Tim was saying earlier about foreign competitors and so forth. And now what we're doing, it's not so much about foreign competitors solving problems. We're actually inviting the foreign competitors in, and we're saying, have a stake in this, have a stake in that. Until you come in, we're not going to give you any breaks on any tariffs. We actually need you to come invest in the United States. How does that play out in the antitrust space and your concerns about competitiveness?
it's not really something that we worry about from an antitrust perspective, because of course in antitrust you worry about, market power. And unless these kind of investments create new market power or cement market power, they don't come under the purview of antitrust. So it's not something which is, it's something where of course Europeans have been horrified at the notion that we had to promise this, and there is a view that in fact we didn't mean it. In fact, it won't happen. But it's not so much an antitrust issue. The more concrete issues are the ones that you and Cree were mentioning earlier, the idea of essentially using tariff increases to effectively mask collective price increases, so forms of collusion. That is a total antitrust issue, which we are already seeing playing out, because in earning announcements, companies are already saying, well, we had to raise prices because of tariffs, and this is an announcement which is made to the market at large and enables and empowers other companies in the same sector to do the same. So that's a form of collusion. And consolidation, for the reasons you described, is an issue. But that is where I would leave it.
If I could just add to what Cristina said, if you think about it in a merger control context, the parties that are contemplating a merger would certainly argue to the agencies investigating that this investment incentive would broaden entry into the market. But as a former enforcer, I would say that argument is probably going to be well investigated, and unless the entry is going to happen within a year or two, which seems a little unlikely in some industries, it's not going to make a difference.
Thanks, Robin.
Maybe I can just add, one of the reasons why antitrust is always a political issue, not just an economic and legal one, which is why as a political scientist I got interested in the topic, is that market power can not only be used to extract economic rents, but market power can very easily, and in almost all contexts, also be used to exert political influence. And so actually, if you're concerned about the sort of imbalance in powerful interests speaking and having a voice in American politics, actually increasing foreign capital stock in the United States might not be a way to address that imbalance. It may have other benefits, but that seems unlikely as a consequence.
All right, can you please all join me in thanking our panel for this robust discussion. Thank you.